What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my Week 7 top 35 wide receiver rankings. And before I actually dive into Tier 1, I feel like I just have to cover all the injuries we're dealing with because it has been an absolute bloodbath at the wide receiver position. So these are just players that I'm not ranking. I'm not saying there's no chance like these guys give it a go, but as of right now, I just don't have a ton of confidence in them playing. And it's a ton of fantasy relevant guys. So we have Puka Nacua, Emeka Egbuka, CeeDee Lamb, Mike Evans, Garrett Wilson, Chris Godwin, Ricky Pearsall, Calvin Ridley, DJ Moore, and Terry McLaurin. Now, I do think there's a chance like CeeDee Lamb, Mike Evans play. Terry could be in the mix, maybe Ricky Pearsall. Guys like Puka, Egbuka, Garrett Wilson don't feel as strong about those guys, but you might have to be digging deep this week at the wide receiver position, either off your bench or potentially on the waiver wire. But not in Tier 1 here. These are the studs: Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jackson Smith and Jigba, George Pickens, and Justin Jefferson. These guys are obviously locks in your lineup. I do want to highlight George Pickens here because he's just been an absolute monster over the last 3 games. He went 8 for 134 and 2 touchdowns, then 2 for 57 and a touchdown, and then this past week, 9 for 168 and a touchdown. He does look like a true wide receiver 1. He honestly just needed a competent quarterback play, and he is obviously getting that with Dak Prescott. And then the last guy in this tier, Justin Jefferson. Those are your studs. You're always playing them. Now, moving into Tier 2, going to start it off with Jamar Chase. And I think, the Joe Flacco experiment, the first week here with the Bengals, I think it went as well as you could have expected. Tough matchup going up against the Packers, but he did what he needed to do. He distributed the ball to his best players. That is Jamar Chase. That is T. Higgins. Chase gets targeted 12 times, catches 10 of them for 94 yards and a touchdown. Feel great about his Week 6 performance, and now has an easier matchup this week going up against the Steelers. Then at wide receiver 6, I have Drake London. And after kind of a slow start to the season through the first 3 weeks, he has logged back-to-back monster games, 8 receptions for 110 yards and a touchdown in Week 4. Then on Monday Night Football, 16 targets, 10 receptions for 158 yards and a touchdown. The Falcons' passing attack has just been so concentrated on their studs with Drake London, Bijan Robinson, Kyle Pitts in the mix. You obviously love to see that for fantasy. Then a guy who also played on Monday night, Rome Odunze, going up against the Saints, and he's coming off really his first down game of the season. Only 2 receptions for 32 yards. Now, I will point out he had a touchdown get called back, and I think it was an illegal formation that both the announcers and the rules official thought was a bad call. So that obviously stings. 3 for 50 and a touchdown looks a lot better than 2 for 32. I'm not really panicking. He's been a stud, still a wide receiver 1 in my opinion. Then I have Jalen Waddle, and in 2 games without Tyreek Hill, he's just been ultra productive. 9 targets, 6 receptions for 110 yards and a touchdown. And then this past week, 8 targets, 6 receptions for 95 yards. Fire up Jalen Waddle with a lot of confidence. Then at wide receiver 9, I have Devontae Adams. I do think he's going to see a bump up in usage, target volume with the Puka Nacua ankle sprain. He had already been, pretty much a locked-in start in your lineup. I think overall, the ceiling of this offense does go down, but he's still steady for me as a back-end wide receiver 1. Then we finally get the season debut of Rashee Rice coming back from his suspension. The Chiefs offense already looked like they were kind of putting things together here. Now they get their number 1 target. Maybe there's some concern about him being a little rusty, starting slow. I'm not super freaked out about that. If I've had Rashee Rice sitting on my bench, I'm itching to get him into my lineup. I'm playing him as my wide receiver 10. Then I have Nico Collins going up against the Seahawks. He's been a little bit underwhelming so far. The volume hasn't been crazy, 7.2 targets per game. And this offense overall, the passing attack, hasn't had the crazy efficiency. So he hasn't necessarily lived up to his ADP, but still someone who I like in that back end wide receiver 1 area. And then the final guy in this tier, Deebo Samuel. In 6 games so far, he's had 4 just super productive games, and then he's kind of had 2 clunkers. He's still the wide receiver 13 in points per game. I love this matchup. The Cowboys are allowing the most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. I believe the Commanders have the 3rd highest implied point total. Feel very good about Deebo this week. I think he can have a nice bounce back. Maybe you dock him a little bit if Terry comes back, but I still think he's going to be a strong option regardless. Now, moving into a pretty large tier 3, going to start it off with Cortland Sutton, and he's had a very kind of weird start to the season where he's had these super strong games and then he's just laid these complete eggs. So these are his 6 point totals so far: 18.1, 1.6, 23.8, 19.1, 17.9, and then 2.7. You're really just hoping you get one of those like 17 plus games and not one where he just completely collapses. I think he'll have a solid game here against the Giants. Then I'm going to go with BTJ. We finally saw a big game out of him: 10 targets, 8 receptions for 90 yards and a touchdown. I've always believed in the talent. He had some, rough starts to the season, some drop issues, still had a tough drop in this game, kind of hindered their ability to come back. It could have actually been an even bigger game. Like, he had a long touchdown get called back because Travis Hunter was offsides. So it's good to see out of BTJ. I think he's kind of approaching potentially like wide receiver 1 range rest of season if he can keep this up. Then I'm going to go with back-to-back Chargers with Ladd McConkey and Quentin Johnston. We also finally got a big game out of Ladd: 7 receptions for 100 yards and a touchdown. The Colts are allowing the 4th most points per game to the wide receiver position, so I have all 3 of these Chargers weapons within this tier. The volume's been decent for Ladd. I believe in the player. I think he'll continue to have strong performances. And then for Quentin Johnston, he missed this past week with a hamstring injury. It seemed like it was still up in the air on whether or not he was going to play like into Saturday. He wasn't officially ruled out until Sunday. So it makes me think he'll have a decent shot to play here in week 7. On the season, he's the wide receiver 8 in points per game. I think you should start him with a lot of confidence if he is healthy. Then I have DK Metcalf going up against the Bengals. DK's production seems a little bit sketchy to me because he's averaging 15.7 points per game, very strong production, but he is really relying on just straight up, top tier efficiency and then also touchdown upside. He's only averaging 6.2 targets per game, and then he's just running hot in touchdowns where he scored a touchdown in each of the last 4 games. I think at some point he could be due for 5 targets, 3 receptions, 30 yards, and no touchdowns, and then you're not going to feel great. But I'm fine kind of riding the hot hand here. Also a pretty solid matchup here going up against the Bengals. Then I'm going to go with my guy Tedero McMillan going up against the Jets. I called that I thought this was going to be a breakout week for him in week 6. He ends up coming through in the touchdown department, gets into the end zone for the first and second time of his NFL career. But then the overall rest of the production wasn't really there. Season low in targets, only 5, 3 receptions for 29 yards. Still someone who's commanded volume at a pretty high level. I believe he's averaging 8 targets per game. I like him here as a mid-tier wide receiver 2 play. Then I have AJ Brown going up against the Vikings. Despite just not being productive this season, he's commanded at least 8 targets in the last 5 games. Week 6, 6 receptions for 80 yards. The Eagles offense just has looked rough, honestly, both through the air and on the ground. Also kind of a tough matchup here against the Vikings. So mid-tier wide receiver 2 with what we've seen so far out of A.J. Brown, I think is reasonable. Then I have Keenan Allen going up against the Colts. Really strong start to the season. Has kind of fallen off a little bit as of late. Under 11 PPR points in each of the last 3 games. But in those 3 games, he was still commanding at least 7 targets in all 3 of them. So the volume's still there. I think he can definitely have a bounce back performance this week. And then in that same matchup, I have Michael Pittman going up against the Chargers. This is something I'd kind of been hinting at in recent videos where Michael Pittman had been very productive. His fantasy point per game number looked really strong, but the volume wasn't crazy and he really was just hitting in the touchdown department. So in the game where he doesn't get to the end zone, not great production, only averaging 6.3 targets per game, which is not ideal. 4 touchdowns on the season, averaging 13.5 points per game. I think back end wide receiver 2 range is probably where he settles in moving forward. Now moving into tier 4, going to start it off with Jordan Addison going up against the Eagles. 2 solid games since returning from his suspension, 15.4 and 15.1 PPR points. That includes him being in the doghouse to start off that second game. This Eagles defense kind of been underwhelming. They're very banged up. You have Quinyon Mitchell, who's dealing with a hamstring injury. They're probably not going to be at 100% going into this matchup. Then I have Chris Olave going up against the Bears. He has been targeted at least 10 times in 5 of his 6 games this season. He's just had a very, very steady floor. Also, just not super scared of this Bears defense. And then also, just a shout out to Spencer Rattler. I think a lot of people thought the Saints offense would just be like completely bottom of the barrel, just gross. I think a lot of people, including myself, thought that Tyler Shuck would be starting at some point. Not that Shuck would be amazing, but just that like Rattler wouldn't be good enough to hold on to the job and the quarterbacks would just be like flipping and flopping back and forth. That hasn't been the case. Like Spencer Rattler has looked very solid. He's kind of in a tough position where the team still isn't great and they're probably going to get a high draft pick. And like, are you going to pass up on a, early quarterback in favor of Spencer Rattler? Who knows? But just shout out to him. He's supporting his weapons. He's looking solid without necessarily the greatest supporting cast around him. Chris Olave, my wide receiver 23. At wide receiver 24, I have Stephon Diggs going up against the Titans. Might seem low to some people. I have been referencing this, but his route participations are still not strong. He had like the one high number, and I think it was week 4, back down to earth in week 5, even though he did have a solid game. Week 6, like 71% route participation. That's typically not startable production. Like I'll talk about some dudes later, like a Matthew Golden, Josh Downs, guys whose usage also isn't great, but were thin this week, and they're kind of in that similar route participation range. And you can see the floor games are there, 3 receptions for 28 yards in week 6. Then also in tier 4, I have Kendrick Bourne. It looks like George Kittle is going to make his return in week 7. We'll see about Ricky Pearsall. Jawan Jennings doesn't really seem like there's that much concern there just because the dude is apparently like playing through every injury possible. I think he said he has 5 broken ribs, high and low ankle sprains, and then some sort of shoulder issue. So if he's got all that going on, it doesn't seem like he's going to be super productive. Kendrick Bourne with 142 receiving yards in back-to-back games. I feel like I got to give him some respect here. Then I have Xavier Worthy going up against the Raiders. Kind of an interesting player to rank because you do have Rashee Rice coming back into the lineup, and that's probably just a net negative for Xavier Worthy, right? He's no longer has the upside to be the number 1 in this offense. But I also think you can make the case that maybe some things get opened up for Xavier Worthy, especially downfield if Rashee Rice is, applying a lot of pressure underneath. Also for Worthy, it's just kind of disappointing, but with him being banged up with the shoulder, he never really got the opportunity to like firmly establish himself, which is not ideal moving forward. I think high-end wide receiver 3 is a pretty fair ranking. Someone who's going to have probably some big splash games, but maybe doesn't have the highest weekly floor. And then the last guy in this tier is going to be Marvin Harrison Jr. going up against the Packers. Suffered a concussion in week 6. No guarantee he plays this week. It's probably like 50-50. If he does, I think he's a high-end wide receiver 3, honestly, regardless of who the quarterback is. And then tier 5, this is actually just a 2-man tier. This is pretty much like talented wide receiver 2s playing behind stud wide receiver 1s. It is T. Higgins and it is Devonta Smith. Overall, I think you have to feel decent about T. Higgins' production in week 6 with Flacco. 8 targets, 5 receptions for 62 yards. Totally fine. It's just like the ceiling and floor are kind of limited here without Joe Burrow. And then for Devonta Smith, averaging 11.2 points per game, only getting into the end zone a single time. Talented player, just not in a super ideal offensive situation. And then the 6th and final tier, for only having 2 teams on bye and 2 teams that are not stacked at wide receiver with the Bills and the Ravens, this is a very gross, like mid to back end wide receiver 3 range. I guess that's what happens when you have just like complete studs injured and like Puka, Egbuka, Lamb, Evans, Garrett Wilson, all of these dudes. You kind of get to this ranking. But starting off this tier, I have Romeo Doubs. He's been targeted 17 times in the last 2 games. Maybe the Packers get Christian Watson back, but Romeo Doubs has really been a guy whose routes have just been very steady. You have like this complete rotation of wide receivers, and oftentimes, I know like from a fantasy perspective, a lot of people have wanted to see some of these other guys get more usage, whether that's like a Dontavian Wicks, a Christian Watson in previous years, Matthew Golden this season. And despite a lot of people wanting that, Romeo Doubs has just always held strong as like the number 1 route runner, just in terms of like volume of routes in this offense. And so his role seems pretty steady. He's on a good offense. He's going to have some touchdown upside. fine option like in the flex, especially just this week with the wide receiver position. Then I have Jameson Williams going up against the Buccaneers. Had a really nice and like much needed bounce back in week 6. 6 receptions for 66 yards and a touchdown. 6 catches in this game. In his previous 4, he had 7 total. So good to see the volume bump up a little bit here. It would be nice to find some consistency, but not sure if you're actually going to get that. Then I have Wan'Dale Robinson going up against the Broncos. This is a tough matchup. The Giants have the lowest implied point total this week. The Broncos are allowing the second fewest points per game to the wide receiver position. Wan'Dale is coming off a nice week 6, 6 receptions for 84 yards and a touchdown, but it does seem like he could come back down to earth here against Denver. Then I have Jacoby Myers. Maybe this is like holding on to my priors and being stubborn, continuing to rank him over Trey Tucker, who has just been straight up better than him this year. Jacoby Myers under 10 PPR points in the last 4 weeks. I would still rather have Jacoby Myers over Trey Tucker in my lineup. I think Myers is due for a bounce back, but if you do prefer Tucker at this point, I really couldn't blame you. He has just been better than Jacoby Myers. Even without that one huge like boom game, he's still just like racking up decent yardage, whereas Jacoby Myers has not so far. I have another Packers wide receiver here with Matthew Golden. This is where it starts to feel really gross, where it's like you're betting on players who aren't even full-time starting wide receivers. Matthew Golden with a 68% raw participation in week 6. But the last 3 games, he's just been productive. 4 for 52, 5 for 58, 3 for 86. They're also working him in kind of creatively, getting him a couple of carries a game, which is fun, just giving him more opportunities. So it's like a desperate back-end wide receiver 3. I think he's fine. Then I have my guy Josh Downs. I'm a huge Josh Downs fan. I'm a believer in the talent. It's very frustrating that the Colts do not use him in 2 wide receiver sets, but he's still managing to produce, even though he's in like the 60 to 65% route participation range. Last 2 games, 6 for 54 and 6 for 42 and a touchdown. I still think he's worth like a stash. I know he's getting cut in a lot of leagues. I know I personally had to drop him in a league or 2. But if you can like spare a spot on your bench, if he can somehow break into those 2 wide receiver sets, he is 100% going to be a starting like caliber fantasy wide receiver. He just needs the usage. Who knows if it happens? And then this last spot here, I might have said top 35 at the top. I wanted to just talk about this guy. You could also throw in like a Trey Tucker, a Kayshon Boutte, Jerry Jeudy could be in the mix. But I went with Luther Burden here at wide receiver 36, and this is why. DJ Moore, hospitalized after the game, did not travel home with the team. So who knows what that's about. The reporting was very odd, where it was just like he didn't travel home with the team. He was hospitalized, went from the game in an ambulance to the hospital, but there was no like actual info on what was happening to him. Maybe by the time you're watching this, we got some more out there. But based on that report, it doesn't seem like he's super likely to play in week 7. We already saw Luther Burden kind of get an increased role in week 6. He was targeted, I believe, 4 times, caught all 4 of them for 51 yards. And so he was already starting to improve on his workload. Olamide Zaccheaus had a really rough drop on like a play that could have been a potential like 80-plus yard touchdown in that 4th quarter. And then you just look at like Luther Burden's skill set. Like his comp for a lot of people was DJ Moore. And so if he's just locked in as a top 3 wide receiver, I believe in the talent. I like what we've seen so far in limited routes from him. If we just know that he's going to be a top 3 wide receiver in routes, which we would if DJ Moore misses, I'd be fine throwing him in there as like a flyer in my flex, and it would just really open up the opportunity for him to earn a larger role moving forward, whether that's potentially cutting into DJ Moore's usage or just like completely throwing Olamide Zaccheaus to the side. But Luther Burden should have been picked up, should have been on rosters heading into this week. If he's still out there, I think he is a really strong pickup. But that is going to wrap it up for my top 36 wide receivers. If you guys have questions about like dudes not ranked, I know with the injuries, it might be really rough. I'll make sure to answer questions down below. If you guys enjoyed the video, do me a huge favor, hit that like button and subscribe, and I will see you all in the next one.